Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Catherine Hamill here, CEO of the Hecht Trauma Institute. I'd like to welcome you to episode 2 of Life Beyond Trauma. If you recall, when we ended episode 1, I was discussing the difference between PTSD and PTSI. So with us today, we have an expert in the field, and Mr. Kevin Connors is our Senior Vice President of Program Development at the Hecht Trauma Institute. Kevin has been in private practice and working as a clinician for the past 40 years. Kevin's specialty is dissociative disorders and treating complex trauma. We are so pleased to have Kevin here with us today, and we are going to talk about first PTSD. So Kevin, thank you so much for being here today, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you join us.
Catherine, thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you. So tell us, what is PTSD?
PTSD is a response to trauma. It's what happens when a person is overwhelmed by trauma. And I like to kind of remind people trauma is when too much happens too fast for us to be able to process it, too much to make sense out of things, and it happens without support from other people. The word trauma is actually the Greek word for wound, and that's really important to understanding how we think about this, because people can be wounded, and we think about it in terms of physical wounds, but we can have emotional wounds, mental, and even spiritual wounds, wounds that affect who we are as a person. So PTSD is really when we've been wounded in a way and we haven't yet recovered from that wounding. So,
So one of the things that I talked about last week, and let's make sure that I was tracking properly. So we're talking about PTSD in the form of what someone would believe to be a physical injury, right? You were talking about earlier how it could manifest itself in a physical way. And if there was a physical injury, one of the things I mentioned was, say someone had a broken leg or a broken arm, and
mhm,
they would use something to kind of splint that or to keep it immobile during the healing process. Um, and PTSD, as you were explaining it, kind of in very similar terms, is something where someone's wounded.
right. Again, it's if we think about the idea of a wound, but we expand it beyond physical for a moment, then we can think about how does a person recover from an emotional wounding? How does a person recover from a psychological wounding or a relational wounding? And there can be, then there are indeed physical responses to this. PTSD, or as we'll get into it in a moment, PTSI, is a total systemic response. In the big book of psychological pathologies, otherwise known as Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, fifth version now, there are 4 different symptom clusters that go with PTSD or PTSI. Hyperarousal, the person is startled, they're easily irritable, they can be provoked, and they can show rage and anger. They're into basically fight or flight. The other side of that is what's called hypoarousal, or they're kind of depressed, blunted affect, very guarded, and often dissociative, checked out. And these are ways that people have of trying to protect themselves, either being really, really on guard or being really blunted and tuning out. The other thing that happens is people have these intrusive memories. They can't turn off what's happening. Um, and with that comes a depressed mood and often real dissociative features where they disconnect from being involved. Um, all of these are different ways that the person has initially of reacting to the situation of being overwhelmed and being wounded. Um, and there are different ways that we want to talk about how we respond to that person and how we can help them heal from that and recover from that. It's important to put that into a perspective that we want to look at the type of wound. Is it more emotional? Is it more relational? How did that wound come about? And that will influence how we respond to the person. If a person falls down and hurts their arm, you look at the extent of the wound or the injury. If it's sprained, you might need an ace bandage. You might get a light splint. If it's broken, you might get a cast. If it's severely broken, they may go in and put pins and all kinds of other issues to deal with it. With psychological wounding, with emotional wounding, we want to look at how that came about, and there's certain key factors, and we make a distinction between where was the cause it from a natural disaster, um, or was it from an accident or a mugging? And the criteria there really is about the relationship between the person and how they got the wound. If it's a natural disaster, it's impersonal. The tidal wave didn't single you out. It just came in and wiped out your village. The earthquake didn't pick on Kevin or Catherine. It
Sure.
shook up all of Southern California.
Sure.
Um, in a car accident, it's a little more personal. In an assault, perhaps in a rape, it feels very, very personal, but sometimes the perpetrator was just there waiting for whoever used the ATM next, and you happen to be that particular person. Um, but sometimes it's someone very close to home, and the closer that is, the more devastating the betrayal, the breakdown of trust, and the damage can be. The other thing that we can look at is the issue of who's there to support or help the person through it.
Mhm.
So we see people who have particular kinds of jobs, police officers, first responders, EMTs, or veterans. And they're in a position where there's just ongoing, unrelenting, unremitting stresses. And are the people they're with, are the people at home, the people they work with, and society around them able to respond to that person and give them support? Or is there a culture that says you don't talk about these feelings? And that failure to talk about it, that failure to address it, takes stress and magnifies it into trauma. Okay. And again, those are the factors that help us understand what kind of trauma, what kind of wounding are we looking at? And then that can lead us to different kinds of ways of responding. Uh,
So
Go
to
ahead.
touch
Yes.
back on that just a little bit, and one of the things that's really important for us to share with our listeners today is why we need to have that shift from PTSD to PTSI. So let's talk
Absolutely.
about PTSI for just a moment. So we talk about PTSI as post-traumatic stress injury.
Right.
And share with us some of the reasons why we need to explore this new way of looking at PTSD.
Yeah. When we
Hi,
call it
Dr. Catherine Hamill
PTSD,
here, CEO of the Hecht Trauma Institute, to share that our mission is to provide education, information, and services to empower and support people affected by trauma. Here at the Hecht Trauma Institute, we believe that all people deserve to live their lives free from the debilitating and often life-altering impacts of trauma. For more on our mission, vision, and values, I invite you to explore our website at www.traumainst.org. Thank you.
At PTSD.
yeah. When we call it PTSD, the very words, the language that we're using is stigmatizing. It's a disorder.
Sure.
And it's saying there's something wrong with you for having this.
Mhm.
Now, if somebody falls down and breaks their arm, we never think that there's something wrong with the person that their arm is broken. We send them our condolences. If we're friends, we say, hey, do I get to sign your cast? Do I decorate it? You send them flowers, what have you.
Sure.
But with PTSD, there's a tendency to then stigmatize it, and avoid it and avoid the person. If we shift our language to reflect that it's an injury, it's a wounding,
Sure.
there's nothing wrong with the person who has these reactions. They're supposed to have these reactions in some way. Um, let's look at the language a little closer. It's post-traumatic stress injury. So
Mhm.
it's happened after some kind of traumatic stress has hurt and wounded the person. Now, there's a diagnostic category called acute stress disorder or acute stress injury, if you will.
Okay.
And what it says is when something really bad happens, you expect the person to be in this particular state
Mhm.
of distress. And hopefully we go in and we acknowledge it, we work with them, they get support, and they process through that within a month or a short period of time.
Mhm.
What can happen is if the person doesn't get the support, if the person doesn't get the care, can't talk about their feelings,
Mhm.
then that acute stress becomes post-traumatic stress, and it becomes more severe, more pronounced, and more long-lasting. So if we shift the language from disorder to
Mhm.
injury, it's something that anyone and everyone can talk about. There's a lot of negative beliefs in our culture when someone says that they've been emotionally wounded. They think that the person isn't strong enough, that there's something wrong with them that led them to even have these feelings. People are afraid to talk about it because it will interfere with their job, it will interfere with their ability to be uh, employed or deployed, depending on where they're working.
Sure.
Um, and others will offer them minimizing comments and fail to really understand it. But if we talk about it as an injury and we start to shift kind of a cultural aspect to it or a societal aspect to it, we make it easier for people to talk about those feelings and to talk about what happened, and we make it easier for people to respond to them. Um, and that's what's so important about recovery is really having other people that can help you work through it. For certain forms of post-traumatic stress injury, there's EMDR and there's prolonged exposure and cognitive behavioral therapies. But the
Mhm.
more severe the emotional, psychological, and I'm going to call it spiritual wounding is, the more there's a need for a relational form of therapy that allows people to then talk about it and explore those feelings and explore what those feelings mean. And if I can take a minute, I want to go back to that concept about spiritual injury.
Yes, please do.
Uh, the military uses a wonderful phrase. They call it moral injury.
Mhm.
Young men, young women sent off to war zones, and they have to do things that they never thought they would do as growing up as a child. They see things that they never thought they'd see, and they witness atrocities they would never imagine. Or a person becomes a police officer with the idea that they want to help, deal with problems. They want to provide meaning and structure, and they want to help other people. And then they have to witness child abuse and domestic violence, or they have to use their weapon in a shooting, and maybe they kill someone.
Mhm.
They're doing something that's so beyond what they ever thought they could do, what they ever thought they would see. So that's the first part of that trauma equation, that trauma wounding, is that it's something too much. It's beyond what they can think about. Now is there somebody to talk to about it? And unless we shift how we even conceptualize this, unless we think of it as an injury and not a disorder, we block their ability to talk about it. We block the way the the job, the career, the society, the culture responds to that person. So I would absolutely love to see people shift from talking about it as a disorder, where there's something wrong with you for feeling this way or thinking this way, into recognizing you've been hurt. What a what an owie. Talk to me about it.
Right.
What's and I think that would be the piece that's to
So
me
let's kind of,
that's incredible. Go
oh,
ahead.
I'm so
Yes.
sorry. So let's kind of explore that for just a moment. And you talked about stress and chronic stressors and acute stressors. And there's a cumulative stress that occurs over one's career, whether it's a first responder, whether it's in the military. And I would also venture to say all frontline and all essential workers have this cumulative stress, and especially in the time of COVID-19.
Yes.
What are your recommendations for those that are listening to this today and realizing that perhaps they have some PTSI that they may need to deal with? What are your professional recommendations for those listening today that would like to seek some assistance?
Um, okay. There's kind of a series of uh, interventions that can happen across the whole person. How they eat, how they exercise, how they sleep, taking care of themselves, finding someone to talk to. So, because PTSI is a whole body systemic kind of a response, you really need to address all of these different levels. People need to eat healthier. People need to make sure that they can sleep well. If they're having sleep issues, talking to their doctor about that part of it is a really critical factor. Um, Learning how to take time for themselves to de-stress, broadening their engagement in other activities outside of the ones that cause stress are really important. A little bit bigger picture, finding someone that they can talk to about what their experience is like. That person could be a professional.
Mhm,
Certainly, that's what a bulk of my practice is involved in.
mhm,
But it can also be a trusted friend. And the goal here is to be able to talk about the feelings and sort things out and try to make sense, try to make meaning out of it. It's not that the person who's listening has to solve the problem
mhm.
so much as be that sounding board, help the person really understand and experience and be able to recognize what it is they're experiencing. Key piece here, the overall goal isn't about getting rid of the event. It's part of what happened to us. It's part of our life. The real goal is being able to integrate it into the story of who we are and to help it find a way to make meaning out of that, find a way to have it make sense in our lives. What does it teach us? What lessons can we learn from it? Can we find something really vital and important within the chaos, the atrocity, within the injury, so that we can perhaps see the world in a different and bigger and perhaps more meaningful way.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us on PTSD and PTSI. And in honor of Mental Health Awareness Month, I would like for everyone to take a moment. And if you are in need of speaking with someone, if you are in need of support, please reach out. Here at the Hecht Trauma Institute, we have an array of free resources on our website, and those can be found at www.traumainst.org. Again, this is Dr. Catherine Hamill, and I appreciate you spending your 30 minutes with us or so, and we look forward to seeing you next month for episode 3 of Life Beyond Trauma. Thank you.